Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Poketown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be going over the top 10 decks in the Stellar Crown format. There is the LAIC on the horizon, it's actually just next Friday. So I thought now would be a good time to go over the most recent tweaks for all of the best Stellar Crown decks. Starting off with still the number one deck, Raging Bolt. This has been the second best performer in the majors and the first best in the online spaces. Now do bear in mind that this is usually a very popular archetype as well in terms of representation of day one, and we do frequently see quite the drop off from day one to day two. So the masses don't necessarily do that well with Raging Bolt, but there are still a huge number of selling points around this archetype, and it still has had a good number of placements. Its matchup spread is pretty appealing as well, to be honest with you. Has favourables into Dragapult EX and Regidrago VSTAR, whereas its worst matchups are the likes of Gardevoir and Snorlax, with Terapagos Dusknoir also being a mildly unfavoured, whereas the other top tier archetypes are manageable. These percentages have been taken from the Trainer Hill data, and we've gone from the very end of September, so just after the first couple of Stellar Crown tournaments, all the way through October and to the start of this month as well. And this is the upper 50% of matches. As for a baseline, Caleb Gedimer's first place 60 from Louisville is still a fantastic place to go off of, with 3 Bravery Charm being a fantastic innovation, giving you more counterplay against the Dragapult and against Regidrago, and generally buffing up your hit points can also be very irritating for Lugia players and Terapagos as well. Some interesting things to note about Caleb's list: no trekking shoes, although they often show up in these 60s. No INO either, so completely lacks any way to interact with your opponent's hand, and chose to have Luminion V in the 60 rather than just going down 3 Pokegear, which is commonplace in most lists. As for top techs right now, I do think the Lost Vacuum is definitely a worthy inclusion, with Gardevoir having such a decent time in the Gdansk Regional Championships. And I also think if you want to have that little bit of hand disruption, either a Judge or 1 copy of INO is definitely worth considering coming back into the 60, so the opponent can't just sit on combinations against you. Going into our number 2 deck, we have Regidrago VSTAR. This is actually the best performer in major events, but far worse in the online spaces at just the 11th place. Regidrago's worst matchups are that Raging Bolt, the Lugia VSTAR, as well as Snorlax, whereas it boasts favourable or very favourable matchups into all of the Stage 2 archetypes, as well as Palkia Dusknoir. It comes out pretty even against Terapagos, and has a mildly unfavoured Iron Thorns matchup. A great baseline is Alberto Conti's first place list from Gdansk. It has only the core dragons in the 60, and is going for 2 stadiums in the list, having that Jamming Tower as a recent include to help deal with those Bravery Charmed bolts, but also has upside into the Gardevoir, which has been upticking. As for top techs then, if you want to incorporate the 1-1 line of the Jewel Seeker Noctowl, there can be situations where this ability is absolutely disgusting and allows you to play the deck quite differently, and there's been a huge number of very strong pilots going for this approach. Additionally, if you're trying to find some wiggle room, I do think there are some dragons worth considering right now. Assuming Gudra is good in the mirror, good against Lugia, good against Palkia, and allows you to also win Iron Thorns, which is currently unfavourable. And then Haxorus is a really interesting inclusion for the Terapagos matchup, because Boufflant is becoming much more popular in that list, so giving yourself the 1-hit KO option is pretty nice to have. And either of these cards, Gudra and Haxorus, are simply just extra dragons that you can discard in the opening stages with your Ultra Balls, Squawkabilly's Researches, so that you can save yourself a V-Star power just by having a higher amount of dragons that you can copy. They're nowhere near as good as the Phantom Dive attack, but they still can be serviceable, and if it means you're saving your V-Star from being flipped, that can often be worthwhile. Going into our third place deck then, we do have that Terapagos. It has been doing the third best in major events and has notably had low day 1 play rates, but then oftentimes jumped onto that day 1 graphic, having fantastic conversion and a decent number of top cuts as well. It's only been performing the 7th best in the online scene, and it looks like it has a number of close matchups, with small boasts against the Raging Bolt and Lugia, and mostly struggling against Dragapult EX builds and Palkia Dusknoir. The deck list I'm taking is from Tord Reckler, the second place list from Gdansk. You can consider this quite a teched out 60, oftentimes you see a thicker line of the Dusknoir and additional Night Stretcher, but Tord 60 has a lot of respect for the controlling matchups with the Palpad and an additional pickup option, whilst at the same time the likes of Penny and Churro can also be fantastic against the likes of Dragapult and Regidrago VSTAR, which are trying to set up multiple KOs with their spread damage, and often go for lower damage output plays that Terapagos EX can tank with, especially in combination with that curly wall. I think jumbling around the Pokemon counts, sometimes you see the 4-4 Noctowl, a 101 Pidgeot, a thicker Dusknoir for example. Those are the main things I'd consider playing around with, rather than the number of one-of supporters and item cards that are in the 60, because they all serve strong purposes. In at number 4 then, we have Lugia VSTAR. This is doing the 5th best in majors and 2nd best in online spaces. It has that horrendous Iron Thorns matchup where it's literally like 10%. It's absolutely terrible. You also struggle a little bit into the Raging Bolt and Terapagos Dustoir builds, with your biggest boasts being that you laugh in the face of most Snorlax 60s, and you also come out on top against Regidrago and Palkia VSTAR quite often. Time and time again, Rahul Reddy has had success with this exact 60, so this will be the baseline that I go off of for this archetype. I think the major point of contention for most Lugia players is how thick you go on the Chinchino count, and whether or not it's worth playing the Basic Energy Vessel Raikou V package, or just go heavier into the rats. In at number 5 then, we have Snorlax Stall. This is doing the 6th best in major events and 4th best in the online scene. It has absolutely jaw-droppingly powerful matchup data, with seemingly its only check-in format being Lugia. Now the 60 that I'm trying to show off is Sander's list, which I admit is substantially more difficult to play than a regular Rotom V60, but I do believe this gives you the best chance to win tournaments because you give your opponent a far less easy prize map, and make the likes of Boss's Orders a far less impactful card for them, meaning that there are some 60s that can still have some respect for Snorlax, but simply still not get over the line against a list like this, where you give them basically no wiggle room. It's also completely fair if you want to go back to a Rotom V approach, and if you're a little sus of some of the supporters in the 60, you can also have a play around with those, no doubt. But there's a reason we always look towards Sander for these controlling archetypes, because he essentially makes it as hard as possible for your opponent to take 6 prizes, and this list accomplishes that. In at number 6 then, we have Charizard. It's doing the 4th best in major events and 6th best in the online scene. Its matchup data is actually pretty appalling, with it's only mildly favourable into Palkia Dustoir, and a host of pretty grim matchups as well, Snorlax, Regidrago, Iron Thorns and Dragapult EX all being awkward for Charizard. It's also had pretty poor day 1 to 2 conversion in the majority of tournaments that I'm seeing, so I'm overall very underwhelmed with Charizard. That said, it still has managed to have a few decent placements, including Sebastian Lashmet's 4th place in Louisville. Not too many standout cards in the 60s, to be honest with you. The Miss Energy is a small nod to the Dragapult and Drago players, but ultimately the deck is trying its best to be as consistent as possible with that high Nestball count, whilst trying to squeeze in the triple stage 2s. As for top techs right now, I do think something like Hisuian Heavy Ball is definitely justified with the amount of one-offs in the 60, and simply having 3 Charmander can be an issue for you at times if you've prized one, because there are a number of matchups that can take out 2 in any given turn, so actually seeing the 3rd Charmander is really important. Palpad can also be considered, especially with the amount of controlling matchups in the format right now. I think with this card, the Churro Thornton boss combination can get you over the line over some of the stalling builds. And a final shout out is to Roxanne. I feel like this is a massive supporter in matchups like Regidrago and Dragapult EX, where they can deny your Pidgeot for large periods of the game. You can still give yourself some hand disruption and actually end on a large hand size yourself to sit on, which can actually help you fight in the matchup without your engine online. Moving on to number 7 then, we have Dragapult. It's the 8th best performing in major events, whereas it's the 3rd best in the online scene. That's a combination of the Dragapult Dustoir as well as the Pidgeot lists, because there are 2 schools of thoughts here. The Dustoir being much more aggressive at trying to target the opponent's board in the opening stages with its Curse Blasting, whereas the Pidgeot approach prefers to sit behind on prize cards, utilising a high countercatcher count and disruption supporters to take multi-prize swings with Phantom Dive. Dragapult has a pretty interesting matchup spread where it's far happier seeing the likes of Charizard, Iron Thorns and Terapagos Dustoir than it is seeing the Regidrago VSTAR, Raging Bolt or Snorlax, and has a close time into Gardevoir, Lugia and Palkia. The list that I gravitate towards most is Ryuki Okada's Dustoir only list. I personally feel like we are in a very aggressive format right now, and I do really like pushing those Curse Blasts in the opening stages, so this is the main build that I'm pushing. That being said, I don't think it's wrong to play a 1-0-1 line of Pidgeot in a build that still has Dustoir in it, because there are those matchups where you can still get that Pidgeot online and give yourself that extra blanket of security that something like Tatsugiri doesn't quite provide. I also think a Pokemon League headquarters is definitely worth thinking about as well. It gives you that extra layer of defense against the Raging Bolt players, and because that's one of your worst matchups, I think it's worthwhile trying to check. And also that Professor Churro scenario, it's a good way to pick up the likes of your Rotom, your Pheasantipity during the game to make your opponent have a harder prize map, and is an extra payoff card to help against the controlling Snorlax matchups as well. Going into our number 8, we have Iron Thorns. It's the 7th best in majors and the 5th best in the online scene. As we know, this is more of a dodge and weave archetype where it's decent into Charizard, really enjoys seeing Lugia, and is also pretty solid into Palkia. It can also be a nuisance for the Regidrago and is even into Gardevoir and Raging Bolt, whereas it has a pretty poor time into Dragapult. Its Snorlax is terrible unless you tech heavily with your cancelling clones, and with more and more Terapagos adding in Bouffalont, it's a real problem matchup as well. The baseline 60 I've taken from Matthias, here with a 5th place finish in Joinville, where they are at least playing those cancelling clones to give yourself a chance against the Snorlax players, so you have a way to push through Mimikyu, because I think without these cards you're dodging too many matchups and won't actually go that far in the tournament. In at number 9 we have Palkia VSTAR. It's the 9th best performing in Majors and the 8th best performing in the online scene. It does have a handful of pretty awkward matchups, the Iron Thorns, Lugia, Regidrago and Snorlax, but one of the 60s we've seen from Gdansk actually has a very good Snorlax matchup, so bear that in mind, and even has some tech Pokemon that you can utilize for these other V-Star matchups that are also showing as unfavorable right now. One of the bigger boasts of Palkia is that it seems to be a real headache for the Terapagos players, so it's a good one to bear in mind if you expect that deck to be upticking. For the Dusknoir approach, I think Stefan's list from Dortmund, a 4th place finish, is a fantastic one to take inspiration from. But then I also think a very cool list was unveiled in Gdansk. Oscar and a number of his testing partners went for a jet build of Palkia V-Star incorporating the birds and the bees, with both Volbeat and Illumise providing fantastic early game attacks, whether you've gone first for setup or second for disruption, by forcing your opponent to shuffle one of their Pokemon back into their deck. And that can be the wiggle room that you need to get your Palkia V into a V-Star, so that you can cash in on that powerful star portal. And the deck also has that little bit of extra energy acceleration with Trumpet with Terapagos EX. This list had very good conversion for how few players were piloting it at the tournament, so it's clearly a good anti-meta pick if you're looking for one. And then finally at number 10 we have Gardevoir. It's the 10th best in major tournaments and the 9th best in the online scene. One of its big boasts is having a good time into Raging Bolt, which is seemingly ever popular in tournaments these days. It also seems to get the best of Charizard often. And then it has a bunch of even and slightly unfavorables, with the worst of it being Lugia, Regidrago and Snorlax. Now I know I'm only showing you a 36th place finish, but this is Henry Chow, a master of Gardevoir, and this list has been replicated by a number of other pilots to very strong finishes at a ton of other regionals since, so it does look like a Turbo Gardevoir is a really strong approach right now. And then the other build of Gardevoir, which has been performing quite well, has been a disruptive approach incorporating that Banette EX with its Everlasting Darkness to lock out items. This can really help with trapping plays and is just a general nuisance for rare candy archetypes and the likes of Drago, which is very reliant on their energy switch for acceleration. So you can buy turns against a huge number of archetypes, which allows you to get your Psychic Embrace online alongside a Dreadabrain to have a lot of damage counter control, helping you get just ahead enough to then turn into this racing archetype that uses Gardevoir EX as an attacking presence, as well as Screamtail and Mew EX. The list looks really weird on paper, but Mateusz has been playing this for a number of months now, so it's got to a point where it's pretty refined. And then if you want to go outside of the top 10, there are a few other archetypes which have had some decent placements as of late. Lost Zone Box's main issue is the Regidrago V-Star, but does boast a decent time into Dragapult and Terapagos. And if you want to play the Iron Thorns in your list, it can also have a decent time into Lugia. Golden Go struggles into Snorlax and Iron Thorns, but seems to be performing well into Gardevoir and Drago. Miraidon's biggest issue is still Charizard, but also that Iron Thorns can be a headache. But you boast a great time into Lugia V-Star. And Roaring Moon is one that I'm actually really interested in, as one of the aggressive archetypes that's still good into Regidrago, but also boasts a good time into Snorlax, whilst having a slightly dodgy Gardevoir and Lugia matchup. Let me know your thoughts of the top 10 down below. How are you building these lists? What are you packing up for the LAIC? Have you already decided, or is it going to be up in the air? And let me know what you think is going to take down the whole event. I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.